Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining us for our monthly webinar series. My name's Jennifer Wilhelm. I'm one of the staff members here at the New Hampshire Food Alliance. And if you're not familiar with our network, we are a network of food system stakeholders from around the state who are working together to support the emerging local food economy. And we offer these monthly webinars for free to introduce you to different topics and exciting things happening around the state and around the country related to the food system. If you are interested, you can check out our website, follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and see what webinars we have coming up. Next month, we'll be talking with the folks who are running the New Hampshire Eat Local Month, and that's happening in July. The Eat Local Month happens in August, so we'll talk about that. And we'll be having a fisheries webinar later this summer in August, and you can find the details on our website. For today, we're going to be hearing from Ian McSweeney. He's the organizational director of the Agrarian Trust, and he'll do more of an introduction for himself, and you'll learn more about the work that he's doing. For the webinar today, he encourages you to ask questions throughout his presentation, and you can do that by using the chat function. So if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little icon that says chat. And if you click on that, you'll be able to type a message and just make sure that it says to everyone, or you can send it to Samantha Cave, who's here assisting. If you have any questions or technical issues, you can also email her, and her email address is there, samantha.cave@unh.edu. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna pull up Ian's slides here. And I just need to unmute Ian. There you go.
Great. I think I'm ready. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Sounds good. So thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you for Jennifer and Sam for hosting this and putting this together, and really the work that the Food Alliance and others do in highlighting the work that's local to New Hampshire and also around New England and around the country. So thank you. A little bit of background on me I'll share, and then I'll give a little introduction to Agrarian Trust, really brief on that end, but happy to answer questions and add more detail of interest. But really, I want to focus on calling forward some significant problems that exist in agriculture and the food system today, and then introducing you to the Agrarian Commons community landholding model that we Agrarian Trust have developed and are now kind of finalizing to move out on the landscape with and create in local communities, and really spend the bulk of the time talking about that model and answering questions you have. So we'll be somewhat brief, but please stop me at any point if you want to learn more. As was stated, I'm the director of Agrarian Trust, a national nonprofit land trust with a mission on supporting land access for next generation farmers. I have a past that includes work in social work, real estate, land use planning, running a private foundation for a number of years. The foundation was focused on this farmland conservation, farm ownership, farm transfer work, primarily in New Hampshire, a little bit around the country. Through that, I really had the wonderful opportunity to create a lot of innovative projects with partners local in communities. So brought forward an option to purchase at agricultural value to New Hampshire for the first time ever, for example, and brought forward other kind of nonprofit and similar long-term to permanent ownership with long-term lease secure conveyance to farmer structures that influence this model as well. I also have a farm. I've conserved it with NRCS. It's a certified tree farm. We share it out to a certified natural CSA vegetable and poultry farm. and manage for habitat in many ways. So really the Agrarian Trust, as I mentioned, National Land Trust, our work is really summarized in 4 key areas to catalyze the national conversation around the demographics of farmland ownership and the realities of farmland transfer that we're going through, whereas it is kind of held up by many and estimated to be around 400 million acres of farmland in the United States will transfer this decade and next because of the age of farmland owners. So who is going to own that land, who will steward and sustainably farm that land, who will have equity and access to that land is really the national conversation that we bring forward. Support network of stakeholders. So we work with a number of aligned organizations, community partners, nonprofits, other land trusts, and work with them in different networks and supportive environments, which I can touch upon. And then really this creating legal container for ownership and raising the capital. So that is the local Agrarian Commons model that I will talk to you about today. And really this mission work manifests in a few ways that I wanted to call forward. One is the Agrarian Commons I'll talk to you about. Another is an interesting network that we've developed of faith lands. We're bringing together faith communities from all faiths, all parts of the country, really aligned around farmland ownership, farmland vision, farmland interest, all in bringing it into sustainable agriculture, providing equity to community. So it's been a network to bring together these stakeholder faith communities, engage in conversations. We're now at this stage where we are recently have launched on-the-ground project in North Carolina to engage farmland holding faith communities there with agricultural communities and farmers and others in need of land, and have staff on the ground now kind of working in community engagement to engage those parties, bring about conversations, and then create new legal structures for ownership or lease tenure or use of the land. Agrarian legal support supports a lot of this backbone of faith lands that I'm mentioning around the legal models, this Agrarian Commons that I'll talk to you about today. And Agrarian Legal brings together legal practitioners and other experienced professionals in this field from around the country for network and committees to innovate projects like I will discuss today. Also to provide support and networking to farmland owners, farmers, and aligned nonprofits around the country as well. So acts as a kind of a connecting resource and kind of an innovation hub for developing models. And then the Our Land Symposium is a national conference that we put on. Last one we did was in New Mexico 2 years ago. Before that, we were in Berkeley 2 years prior. We're planning another in the southeast part of the country, and it's really to bring together many voices, both local to that region and national voices and some international voices as well, around the issue of farmland ownership, the transfer, and who will have equity and how the land is stewarded and farmed. So Agrarian Trust, we work at a national scale. So this map is created by American Farmland Trust. The darker the color shows the higher quality farmland and the higher risk of development, and where the dark green and the dark red overlap is the most critical land for farmland for potential loss to conversion and development. So we Agrarian Trust, when we think, we are thinking nationally, and there's a lot of areas of this map that are under significant threat outside of New England and the Northeast Quarter and the West Coast that really many should be focused on, we would feel, and that is part of our mission, is to really work where others are not working and to innovate and partner in areas where others are working. So we believe strongly in this quote and wanted to put this forward as a real framing for our discussion, that land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality by Malcolm X, and feel that our food system and a lot of the work we all do depends upon a stable land base and expects that stable land base. And I would say that that does not exist. Next, or advance, please. And this statistic is a glaring example of why this does not exist. That less than 2% of farmland is owned by people of color is disgusting. And it's an unstable and an unhealthy reality of ownership. So, how can we have freedom, justice, and equality when ownership is not equitably dispersed across the landscape? But so wanted to call forward several critical facts that most were brought from recent ag statistics report and other reports that have come out recently. But these are pretty sobering, I feel. We all can read these ourselves, but just the age demographics, the appreciation of land values, the consolidation of ownership, the fact that 37 mid-sized farms a day close in this country, as reported from recent ag census 2012 to 2017, and that farmers have the highest suicide rate in the country. I think of, and we think at Agrarian Trust, a lot of that speaks to the unstable base of land, who owns and who has equity in, and thinking that we can provide support in a food system that doesn't have a stable base creates some of the crisis areas pointed out here. So big issue, big landscape we have, and really it's a human relationship, both to the land and to each other, that we feel at Agrarian Trust is the solution. So the solution is small and local and interpersonal and connected to the land, and yet the issues are overwhelming and large. So we, Agrarian Trust, have come together with these organizations named, the organizations providing legal, financial, and other support and assistance to develop this Agrarian Commons model. So the Agrarian Commons model takes inspiration from many, and so I wanted to list and call out some of those here on this slide. But thinking back to the land and equity in land and access to land, and how some of these models really do a wonderful job at addressing that. So we find inspiration in them. The Tierra de Liens model mentioned, I'd encourage everyone who's not familiar with to check out that model. It's operating in France and has been since 2003. And it's in many ways similar to what we're proposing here, and is one of several models that exists in Europe and a number of models that exist around the world for this kind of commons-based land holding. But it's somewhat new here in the States. So we get a lot of inspiration from those listed and from the work of many over time and their experience, and really to develop the model here. So what we see is we, Agrarian Trust, a national 501c3 nonprofit land trust, should set up a structure for land holding. So I'll share a few slides with you now that are pretty text heavy, and we'll really talk through the model. So I'd welcome questions, happy to stop. I'll give some pauses along the way. But so we, Agrarian Trust, are a national organization. We see there's great benefit in national organizations, in regional organizations, and local organizations. And at the same time, there are obstacles and deficiencies to each. So that there's strengths and weaknesses to national, regional, and local entities. And what we were looking to do, Agrarian Trust, was blend a national organization, and what we saw as the strengths and benefits of a national organization with multiple local organizations, and what we see as the strengths and really kind of where the center should be, being the local organization, in that the local entity should have ownership of the assets, should have ownership of the land, should hold the equity, and should have some ability for self-determination of those assets. So the local entity having those and then being supported by national organization is what we really see as this model. And we see that local should be the center, as I mentioned, because local identity and priorities and community should influence and create the local 501c2 Agrarian Commons structure for that community in place, and that likely would be different than another community in place. And we, Agrarian Trust, would have some guidance and kind of overarching principles, but then would support these multiple diverse local landholding entities across the country. So really, we see these 501c2 landholding entities as being entities that could hold farmland and all other agricultural assets and property for a community-based commons benefit. That benefit would in part be providing access, tenure, and equity to leasee farmers, who would, the farmers would secure long-term financial equity building leases on the property, and they would operate independent sustainable food production farms that will look different depending on their interests. But the local Agrarian Commons would hold those assets and provide support to those farms, and then the local Agrarian Commons would be made up, the board itself, of stakeholders being leasee farmers who are on those farms, other community stakeholders that are connected to that community and have some alignment and interest in those farms, thinking that the power of collective work, once there is a common ownership and some level of autonomy and independence for the farms, could really blossom in the Agrarian Commons board structure. So having a structure where it's centered on the farmers and other community stakeholders, and then supported by Agrarian Trust staff and Agrarian Trust appointed state sanctioned and licensed practicing lawyer who's working with that commons, would really be a way to support that local commons ownership that can then in turn support those local farms by pulling the benefits of each, the national, the local, and then the independent farm, into a collective benefit of all. And really the goals being kind of the supportive ecological restorative agriculture on the ground by the independent farmer, they having secure lease tenure to operate in that way. Ecological stewardship investment by all the parties involved, the National Agrarian Trust, who is able to raise a national interest and awareness and philanthropic dollars, the local 501c2 Agrarian Commons, who is the owner of those land and property-based agrarian assets, and then the land stewards, the farmers themselves on the ground, but a real shared approach to that, and not burdening the farmer with dealing with degraded land and all the costs to repair and restore soils and ecosystem, but instead looking at ways to collaboratively do that and really reinvest national wealth in local land and community. And through all this, support viability of community wealth and local agrarian economies. And we really see that this model of multiple entities connected together focus on ownership and long-term secure tenure is the only way to get at all the crisis areas that I brought up earlier. That, you know, most of those crisis areas pointed out around demographics and wealth disparity and so on are tied to private ownership interests in many ways. And until we begin to focus on and address that, we continue to have these issues of significant transfer of farmland, of kind of concentration and aggregation of landholding and wealth. So we really need to find structures that focus on equity, equity being racial, economic, financial, social, and community equity, and really, you know, a broad understanding of equity around land ownership and self-determination. So with this model, we've developed the model with the partners shared. We are now in a stage where the agrarian legal that I mentioned earlier has a national committee that is meeting now to work through and provide input and commentary on guiding principles for these agrarian commons, guiding principles, things like farm standards, stewardship standards, and others. Also working on agreement documents, things like a lease standard that gives long-term secure tenure and some financial equity building components. And other documents such as that, also kind of the relationship between the farms and the C2 and the C2 and Agrarian Commons to C3. So as all that kind of gets worked through with this national committee of experts from a number of organizations and practitioners and people connected to the land, we're learning a lot. We're evolving the model and these documents, with the timeline and objective there being that by this late fall, that work will be done. We'll then publish that as an open source document, both the template documents we create, but also the commentary and narrative of all those involved. You can find out more about that now just by going to our website under the Agrarian Commons on the Initiative tab, and then you can find the Agrarian Commons Creation Committee and see who's part of that and see a greater overview of the documents involved. And so with that complete, we'll then publish that out for the world and provide that as an access tool for anyone who has an interest. A number of organizations involved in that committee are also either co-creating with us Agrarian Commons local to their communities, or creating similarly aligned models themselves, and will be using some of the documents for that. Others involved in the committee are just knowledgeable, experienced experts in the field who are providing their insight and expertise to develop the models. But as that is finished, as I shared, we'll announce those out. With the announcement of those out, we'll then also be announcing out the launch of the Agrarian Commons, which kind of the highlights are bulleted on this slide. So let me pause for a minute. I see there's one question. Let me answer that, and then I can come back to this slide. But if there are other questions or any input, please type in now. But to the question, once land is in trust, can it be returned to tribal ownership? Returned to the original inhabitants, say native peoples? So that's a very good question. We're exploring that both in this, and just had a conversation that involved that in our call yesterday in this Commons Committee, and are also having our legal partner, Sustainable Economies Law Center, whose icon was listed on the partner slide a little while back, look into that. So part of the struggle with that is that once land or other assets come into the trust, they're coming into a nonprofit ownership. So then to transfer them back to a private ownership, issues of private inurement have to be attended to. And so, you know, they could be sold potentially for a market value to then use that money to further programmatic and mission related work of Agrarian Trust, but that would not be our interest. Selling land back to native inhabitants is not a solution in our mind. The giving back and letting go of land too is in our mind. So we're looking in to see what's possible with that. So as we know, the kind of findings of that will be reported out in this Commons Committee. It may be that the best way to approach that is to set up a structure and kind of partnerships that allow us to advocate for land going directly to Native peoples and not into a nonprofit trust. Might be a much simpler approach, and it might be a way that we could really, with partnerships, we could advocate for certain land going in that direction and not into this structure, and would be happy to do that, but we'll know more as time goes on, and then we can refine our approach. So would each Agrarian Commons own only one or multiple properties? So good question. And so what we see is that these local Agrarian Commons should be human scale. And human scale being that everyone connected has representation on the board. So each leasee farmer of a property has representation on a board. And then other community stakeholders and Agrarian Trust all need that representation piece, and a board cannot be too big and still be able to function. So there's a limit on the number of farms in that way. We also see a benefit to having multiple farms in the ability to work collectively in ways, or to share costs or services in other ways between those farms. And to really kind of think about how economies of local scale could be of benefit. So we see, you know, each local community and that Agrarian Commons should define their size, but we see something in the range of maybe 4 to a dozen farms being an appropriate size for an Agrarian Commons. Final determination by local community and those farms involved, but really at the size of 4 to 12 farms, you're not getting so large that you lose that human connection. You're also at a scale where you can think about sustaining itself. Part of this, to jump for a minute, is that through the land ownership by the Agrarian Commons by a 501c2 entity, there is greater latitude in lease relationship to private farmer entity. So the ability to provide affordable leases or stewardship investment in lieu of lease or other arrangements is possible. So that's a way to further support farm viability and still generate some lease revenue. The lease revenue then goes to the C2. So at a 4 to 5 farm size, affordable lease revenue that supports the farm's viability can also support the sustainability of a Agrarian Commons entity local in place. So see that as, and there's other factors too, but see that as an appropriate size. And if it got larger than 10 to 12 farms, say, it would probably be more appropriate to think as nature does and think about division, and to not think as cancer does of kind of unfettered growth would be our thought. Another question, with the amount of land expected to transfer and the high volume of farmland in many communities, is there enough capital in the landscape to achieve the scale that is needed? Yes, so that's a real good question. We get asked that question, and we struggle with that question a lot. Our model that we see is really a small community scaled approach that we see success would be when it is of interest and created and adopted across the country in multiple different diverse models that exist. So we are not looking to scale up to a point of addressing that 400 million acres, but what we're looking to do is scale up to a point of having diversity of models across the country that all could identify with and then use as models to create their own community-based landholding structures. And whether there is enough capital to do that is a very good question. But I would challenge that in that the appreciation of land values and the concentration of land ownership and land-based wealth is unhealthy at its present stage. And if we think the only solution is investment capital or charitable capital to simply pay off that land-based equity into financial kind of returns that can be banked somewhere, we're not changing the realities of concentration of wealth and disproportionate ownership across the landscape. So we're the age of farmland owners, there's a lot of people who don't have a successor farmer and may only need so much money to retire, or may really love a vision and legacy for the future. And conservation land trusts have been proving this for decades. There's a real interest of landowners to donate, whether conservation easements or fee interest in land. And we already see, we have several models we're working with now with landowners wanting to donate land in, and see that's a real potential of donations and bargain sales, and thinking about how to redistribute the land-based wealth that is concentrated in the way it is. Another question, and then I will pause and move back to the slides, but please continue to add questions and we can circle back. So let me answer this one last. Can you explain revenue model at local level in more detail that sustains local 501c2 or C3? Sure. So, so the C2 is the land holder of the farmland and other agrarian assets. The C2 is limited in scope by IRS to being a landholding entity. It cannot engage in programmatic work like a C3, so couldn't engage in education or community outreach or other type programmatic or mission related work. It's just a landholding structure. So the C2 holds the land. Agrarian Trust mission and principles are, we are creating this structure, and we strongly believe in moving land out of private ownership into a community-based commons, also moving land out of private ownership and out of the commoditized marketplace. So in our bylaws and in the C2 bylaws created, and restrictions on land held will be a restriction against future market-based sales of that land, and a restriction against encumbering that land by debt. So the land is held unencumbered by debt, and then with kind of the carrying costs of taxes, insurance, and upkeep in a partnership with the leasee farmer and the C2. The leasee farmer has affordable lease rates to support their farm enterprise, but those affordable lease rates are generating some revenue. That revenue in total is collected by the C2. The C2 then has that revenue to then allocate in a budget for its needs. So we can come back to other questions as we go, and if that needs further clarification, I'm happy to dive back into that answer as well, but let me move on in a few of the slides. So we're now at the stage where this late fall we'll be publishing out the work of the committee with these documents and our findings on a number of these questions. We have also, during the last few years, been developing a number of projects with farmers and farm landowners around the country. So have a number of these kind of already under contract and raising money quietly and bringing together partnerships quietly as we speak. Others are still in that negotiation development stage. But whereas the end of this calendar year, all should be at the stage where we're ready to kind of move forward with public fundraising and telling the story of this, which should be at a stage by end of 2019 where we're creating 6 local agrarian commons in different communities around the U.S. So we see geographically a local agrarian commons could be as large as a state. It would have to be registered in that state. We're providing Agrarian Trust. We're providing a lawyer who works in that state to sit on the board of that Agrarian Commons. But the local identity is going to drive the geographic focus area. So whether the local Agrarian Commons is a region of that state, is across state lines to capture kind of more of a food shed or economic region or landscape, the location and exact geographic area will depend upon local input, but they will be registered by state and federally. And so we'll create 6 local agrarian commons. Those in total, when we launch in 2017 with kind of projects under contract in the middle of fundraising for, we'll have 10 farm properties that will come into those commons. So some will have 2, some will have 3 farms coming into them, but all will start with 2+ farms coming into them, seeing that kind of need for at least a pair of farms to launch the work and then grow into the size that I shared. A number of those farms have multiple farm enterprises on them, and then kind of the jobs that they kind of given the farms we're presently working with have, and then the acres that those farms, given those we presently have, that's what that looks like as kind of a scale for the total. So why don't we move to next slide, and I'll answer some questions. Kuwait, yeah, so let me jump on answer the questions first, and then I'll get into the rest of the slides are then giving a little more detail on 4 of the farms involved, and wanted to focus some on local. So I'm highlighting 2 New Hampshire farms that are involved. New Hampshire will be a Agrarian Commons created, also highlighting 2 Tennessee farms. Tennessee will be another Agrarian Commons created. So those are, 2 of the 6 Agrarian Commons and 4 of the 10 farms that I wanted to give you a little more depth on, but also happy to answer questions and talk through more of the model itself. So why don't I start with the questions that are queued up, and then I can begin to walk through the farms involved. So have the 6 Agrarian Commons already been created? So probably partially answered that here in that, so that in a couple of the states, we have kind of some of the board members, 2 of the farms identified and the in-state lawyer identified, but are still looking for and open to other farms and other community partner board member potentials there. Other places we don't yet, we're kind of in discussions with farms and don't yet have under contract and are open to kind of additional farms and other board members, and then a few, may be viable in the fall, but are also maybe, we're engaged in a lot of other conversations that those that don't kind of become viable and ready by end of this calendar year would be for future work. So we're happy to explore other possibilities, and whether they fit in this fall to winter or into future work would be a question as we explore them, but happy to explore more, really, so that we're want to identify and make viable these projects with the 6 Agrarian Commons. We then Agrarian Trust, the 501c3, legally create those 6 Agrarian Commons C2 entities and have kind of all the template documents together for those. But there's a process to do that where it's better to group them together in an application. So, the timing of this will be they're all created, or all applications filed for creation end of this calendar year. And then depending upon approval process would be mid 2020, likely, when they're legal entities and have a seated board and operational. Another question, have your models incorporated housing? Housing and farmland for the farmers is huge. Where I live, an integral part of what is needed, eco-village for large tract of farmland, is the land owned by the trust. So yeah, our model is very focused on housing that are named the Agrarian Commons. In this feels that it's farming, but it's also other land-based business enterprises, and it's the people and community that make it all viable and make it a healthy agrarian commons in our mind. So providing for the total is critically important. One of the kind of inspirations we see is the work of many community land trusts across the country. Some of those who have a focus on farmland of some type, there's even more of an alignment and inspiration we find, but that, community land trusts in totals work to address equity and affordability around the financial realities of housing and other built infrastructure, is a model for us and many others to learn from in this work. And so that influences us quite a bit. On a number of farms that we're working with now, they're going from kind of retiring farmer into these next generation farmers and farming. And farming is changing, as we all know, in many ways. So a lot of what we're thinking about in some projects we're involved in now is where and how to build additional housing on the farm to add diversified and layered farming enterprises or other agrarian enterprises on site to create really communities, agricultural communities in place, and feel that this model and the fee ownership of land allows for that in a way that other conservation work does not. So that's why we're focused on fee ownership and not conservation easement work. We are partnered with conservation land trusts who already hold easements on some of the farms we're working with. Others will put conservation easements on as we take ownership. Excuse me. Excuse me. And others we'd pursue in the future easements. So yeah, housing is very important. Would you expect the C2 organizations to hire any employees or be managed only by the board? So that's we would have input and advice on that, but ultimately the decision would be driven locally on that. But our thought would be that the collection of the rent revenue by the C2 would give them a revenue source to provide an operating budget to hire on staff. And through that long-term affordable lease revenue coming in and being a secure, sustainable model for the farmer, it can also be a secure, sustainable model for the C2 in generating revenue to cover staff costs. So whether it's staff, whether it's hiring, consultants or others as kind of specific needs come up, or kind of other things would be determined locally, but we see the potential of the money being recirculated locally as being a way to financially sustain the human capacity needs of the agrarian commons that are local to place. Another aspect of that is that the Agrarian Commons, these C2 boards, we want to create a structure that does not overburden farmers specifically and other community stakeholders with another board to sit on and more meetings to go to. And really it's a C2 board that is owning 4 farms, for example, where each farm has a 99-year secure lease to a farm enterprise, may not have much work to do many years and may only have work to do when things fall apart or there's struggle or issues come up that have to be addressed. So the work of the C2 of any substance may be episodic in nature, where they could time staff as needed, or they could kind of rely on Agrarian Trust for those kind of transition periods or issues that come up. So different ways to address that, but do see the need for the C2 to have human capacity and financial resources to support that human capacity. Another question, if the farm and other assets are owned by the C2, will that limit the farmer in qualifying for financing and operating to acquire the assets? Yes, significantly. That, year in and year out, many studies put out by farm support organizations call forward farmer kind of primary obstacles around farm viability, and time again, their access to land and access to capital. We see this model as trying to address the access to land component. This in some ways makes the access to capital reality worse. We are taking the land-based equity away from a farmer and the land-based appreciation value away from a farmer as well. There's reasons why we're doing that. We feel that decommodifying land is a way to bring land back into its natural cycles that value land for its soil, its ecosystem, its connection to human health and growing of food, that our own lifespan, our own business lifespan, the time it takes to regenerate ecosystem and soils is much times longer than private ownership. And all those crisis points I pointed out, all kind of in our mind for Agrarian Trust, point to the reasons for not having private ownership. But removing private ownership does make that capital issue worse for farmers. What we're doing in the Agrarian Commons project and the fundraise for this is that, there's fundraising for a variety of aspects of bringing about this model. 20% of all money we raise is raised into a revolving loan fund to provide access to capital for those farmers who are connected to the Agrarian Commons. And we're also working to partner with other organizations to have access to capital in similar ways through them for those farmers, to try to provide other opportunities for those farmers to access capital, because we realize we are making their opportunities to acquire capital even more difficult. But the realities are we're making those opportunities to acquire capital all the more difficult for the people who own land. And many people don't even own land. So we need to create a model that works for everyone. Another question, I missed the very beginning. So Agrarian Commons are different from community land trusts in a few ways, and some of it really comes down to just the identity and primary focus of Agrarian Trust as an organization compared to other nonprofit community land trusts and their primary mission. Other area comes down to kind of the scale and kind of that multiple organization structure that I'm discussing with you. The vast majority of community land trusts are local or regional and smaller in scale and don't have a kind of national connection or kind of a national affiliate support entity in that way. and most community land trusts aren't focused on production agriculture. So it very similar in much of the model and much of the structure and makeup, but different in those ways. And really kind of, we've spent a lot of time, a number of us involved have been involved in community land trusts and in conservation land trusts. And really it was early on discussions and kind of consideration of the two models highlighted the difference in growth of either model, community land trust or conservation land trust, and how kind of they went from, you know, the trustees for reservations in Massachusetts or new communities in Georgia as kind of pioneers in each, and then grew to the number they are today, and where they are in the landscape and the number of acres and they hold and dollars they raise, and there's significant difference in the two. And some of that we would attribute, whether rightfully or wrongfully so, some of that we would attribute at Agrarian Trust to the Land Trust Alliance and the regional and national support networks and organizations like American Farmland Trust and others that have really helped to support, align with, and kind of hold the lead as being a kind of the national entity or the experience entity or the willing leader entity to grow the conservation land trust movement and work across the country. So we're thinking our model can help local community land trusts kind of expand their capacity, reach, and awareness building within a national community. And so, for example, some projects we're developing and talking with now are with existing community land trusts that are wanting to focus more on agricultural land. So we're talking about a partnership to bring, you know, a shared agrarian commons to place local to them. So it's, you know, it's really how do we work in partnership to expand the work we all do, and this is just trying to meet some of the areas that community and conservation land trusts do not. So we're coming close to the end. I do see a number of other questions. I'll go through these quick, and I'll really I have all this case study material, but was more thinking that if, you know, we didn't have enough questions or discussion, that was happy to dive into this. This really gets more into the details of a lot of the projects. If maybe we could jump ahead a handful of slides to, there's just a text heavy summary slide of kind of the, keep going, the impact of these farms, just to people could read through as that's great, thanks. And I'll just keep going on the questions for the last few minutes we have. But, you know, those can look through. This is the impact of those 4 farms that will be the founding farms in New Hampshire and Tennessee that will be 2 of the Agrarian Commons created. And it gives a good identity of the type of farms we're working with, the scale, the kind of community engagement and partnerships we're interested in as well. So back to the questions. Is there an opportunity to work with stakeholders working to create and preserve recreational trail system using same model to preserve needed land for public recreational use and possibly agritourism? Yeah, there's well, so our really inspiration on a lot of this commons structure and modeling comes from a lot of work around the world that goes on around community and commons-based ownership of assets. So there are models. There's someone, Matthew Hoffman, Hoffman, who's at University of Southern Maine, and then farms some in Vermont. So he's local to kind of this audience on some level. But he's does a lot of research, study, and engagement in European countries that are working a lot with common structure, and is also working to develop a trail recreation stewardship-based common structure for private land ownership in Vermont now. So Matthew Hoffman, I'd be happy to introduce people, or just look them up and reach out to them. All right, well, so we are near the end. There's a request to kind of go through the slides. So let me just leave it on this slide for a minute, and I'll talk about the slides prior, and then we can just advance to the final slide so people have that. So yeah, so we have been working with these farms for a number of years in New Hampshire and Tennessee, so that's why they're kind of earlier stage involved. A number I was working with in years prior when I ran a private foundation and really trying to explore with them new models for land ownership. Many of these farms already have conservation easements on them. The conservation easements don't protect farming practices, soil health, affordability, who actually gets equity and gets to farm, food production, or community type values or goals. And that's something all these farmers are vocalizing, having land already under conservation easement. So they value the easements protecting the natural resources, but they're looking for something to do more. So overall, we're trying to create a real diversity in these models in all aspects of what we do. The Tennessee projects are two of the pioneers in Tennessee. The oldest and first CSA, an organic farm, a diversified vegetable cattle operation, Long Hungry Creek Farm. It's just about 300-acre farm, about an hour and a half east of Nashville. It's a farmer who's been there for his career and will be retiring in the next few years. Needs to think about succession, has started to, and has some successor farmers in place, but we need to think more deeply about that. The other farming couple, Alfred and Carney Ferris, own the largest non-GMO organic grain and cattle farm in Tennessee. It's just north of Nashville. They're in their mid-80s, and they've recently moved to no-till and direct-to-consumer sale of all their products into animal foods, baking, distilling, other value-added production needs. They are needing to retire as soon as they can. So those Tennessee farms really provide the need to transfer farm business, farmers, and the land into new operations from long-standing businesses that have been there in place and really pioneers in the organic movement in Tennessee. In an area, Tennessee and kind of southeast, that gets little land trust support and work. In an area, Nashville, that's one of the faster growing mid-sized cities in the country, and land is quickly being developed and converted. The New Hampshire farms are mid-career farms who want to continue on, but struggle with affordability and struggle with easements that don't address and protect farming and community values and ecosystem values that I mentioned earlier. So looking to kind of more deeply engage in community and more comprehensively protect the land itself. And they're also looking to kind of expand and layer on additional farming enterprises to farm more in community structure. So really all these farms mentioned, part of the plan in the fundraising for acquisition is adding additional housing and adding solar renewable energy production to cut down on energy costs. Energy costs in New Hampshire are some of the highest in the country. The two farms mentioned combined have energy costs of over $75,000 a year. Just for electricity alone, let alone propane for heat, is additional costs. So considering it ways to bring about sustainable energy production, additional housing, and more healthy community in place really drives their interest. If we could jump to the last slide. And all the farms work in kind of a variety of diversified food production and sales models locally and into more urban environments close to them. So we're coming up right on time now. Thank you all. I'm happy to answer other questions that exist, and wanted to leave people with this slide asking, to engage, follow us on social media, reach out to me by email. My email is ian@agrariantrust.org. You can subscribe to our newsletter. The link is listed there. And yeah, engage to find out more. Would be happy to talk to any of you who want to have further discussion or learn more or dive more into the slides provided. And I'm also happy to stay on this call for a little longer if there are other questions.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's great. If you need to head out, feel free to log out. We will be posting a recording of this presentation on the New Hampshire Food Alliance website, and we can include all the questions that were asked as well, and the slides. If you are able to stick around and ask more questions, it sounds like Ian's willing to hang out and answer them, so feel free to type those in the chat.
Yeah, so question, are you working in the Pacific Northwest? So yes, have the two kind of locations that I was sharing with you now, have a number of other locations and farms that are kind of in development stages, and different variations of that. Have some work in Washington State that is well developed and could have added at least one of those farms into this as well, kind of have agreement or moving forward with that in the fundraising stage of things. And that farm is a different model in that it's farmland owned by non-farmer, former organic lavender farm, presently has been fallow mowed field for a number of years. So is really kind of it's absent of infrastructure in general on this one farm I'm mentioning now, and it's really so that what type of farm, what buildings, infrastructure investments are needed, and who has opportunity for land access on that are all questions that we're beginning to explore, and would be happy to have a conversation on that with anyone who's local to there. But yeah, so I have some land projects now in Western Washington, and then have discussions going on elsewhere in Washington, in Oregon, and also in Montana to cover the Pacific Northwest was the question. So another, when should we get involved if we're interested in establishing an agrarian commons in our community? I'd say to be in touch and let's see kind of, what your interests are, what opportunities exist. We feel Agrarian Trust that this is one model that could be used. We also feel this is one model that could be instructive for others. And we are also happy to share our learning and support that happens as an organization and through the Agrarian Legal Network. So happy to be a resource in many different ways to other communities who are interested in community-based land ownership structure. So whether it is specifically an agrarian commons and the model I'm describing here, or it is a variation on that, happy to have conversation and explore potential. Any of those models we feel are kind of most viable when there's kind of a few community stakeholders that exist who want to see that happen, and there's some land potential, whether it's landowners with land and interest, or it's people using land and wanting to gain secure access, or it's or it's kind of a real need and capacity to take on kind of that lease tenure and ownership structure of land and kind of some identified land that would be ideal, but to have some of those kind of basic vision around land and people components in place is where we see it's going to be most viable, but happy to explore with anyone who has interest in thinking about agrarian commons model or other community-based land ownership structure local to them.
Great, thank you so much, Ian. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll put the recording up and be in touch with the link when that gets up on the website.
Thank you all.
All right, take care, everybody.
Have a good day.